Tan. Ah. Pero no me reconoce el sonido del audífono. No me está sonando acá. ¿Lo he puesto mal? Ah, pero... ahora sí, está mal conectado en todo caso. Ahora sí. Ta-da-da. Ta-da-da. Ta-da-da-da. Mm. Distance. I don't like this. Okay. Okay. Mm. Da-da-da-da-da-dum. Oopsie. Da-da-da-dum. Ah. Hostia, soy yo, el juego se ve diferente. El juego se ve diferente, ¿no?
Sí,
Está diferente, ¿no? El sonido del motor es diferente también.
obviamente.
¿Ah? Ha habido una actualización ahora.
Sí.
Sí. Y una actualización fuerte. Sí. Ponte los... ¿Quieres escuchar? Ah, ya. El sonido está mucho mejor. Se siente diferente. Sí. Está diferente. Up. ¿Mm?
Voy a escuchar.
Póntelo. El motor está bien diferente. Un ratito, voy a... Ah, no, voy a acelerar.
Sí, es un distinto.
Ahorita vas a ver cómo... Ah, está diferente, ¿no? Yo no me acuerdo que sonara así.
Es uno más suave que antes. Mm.
Tararara. Está bonito. Suena bonito. Tengo un mejor control del camión también. Más que todo su aceleración. Es más fino. Ok. 8 toneladas, 15 horas. Eh, let's start. Ah,
Yeah. Uh, Back on the game. Solos. Mm. Okay. Twisted Metal Hollow. Mm. Mm-mm. Ah. Mm-hmm. Gangsta Paradise. Oh. Mm. Suffering. I don't know what to watch. What should I watch? Super Mario, Super Mario, Super Mario. New video. Ah. Nope. Mm. The walls are bleeding. Scania. Yeah. Caso de Mortal Kombat. StarCraft. Wait. Was about to watch a video about what's the name of this? This.
This story was sent by Joseph Robinson and took place in 2017. He had just moved into his first apartment after moving out of his parents' house. It was an old 2-story home built in the 1930s and had been converted to 3 units, with 2 downstairs units and 1 upstairs unit. Joe was in the upstairs unit, which was a decent-sized 2-bedroom unit with a large kitchen and a pantry. He lived with his German Shepherd. At the time, only one of the bottom units was rented out, and he knew this because there was a car parked under one of the 3 spaces in the back of the building. That was the only way he could know someone was there, as they never left the house. And Joe knew this because he worked from home most days and did event photography during the night at a local theater. Throughout the time Joe would be home during the day, he never saw anyone leave the bottom unit, but he knew someone was there because he could hear the sounds of someone walking around and talking. After living there for almost 3 weeks, Joe started to notice strange things, like rustling in the living room walls and a thumping coming from the guest room. If he left the house, he would come back to find things moved around and sometimes missing. He had the management company change all the locks, but even after this, these strange things would continue. One night the theater was closed for repairs, so Joe didn't leave the house that night. Joe's brother needed to borrow his car as his was in the shop. The house was about a 10-minute walk from the downtown car garage where his brother had just left his car, so Joe's brother just walked over to borrow his car. The two caught up a bit, and then he took Joe's car to do whatever it was he had to do. Joe stayed inside for the rest of the day and got caught up on some editing he had been putting off. At around 9:30 p.m., he started to hear a voice down the stairs leading to the front door. The way the house was set up, there was a door that led outside a little entryway with a staircase that led to the actual apartment upstairs. This entryway shared a wall with the occupied unit upstairs. So Joe thought it was just the echo coming from the downstairs neighbor. However, it started to get louder and louder until he could clearly hear what the man was saying. He was arguing with himself and laughing hysterically. He kept telling himself it was time, only to follow up with a loud and aggressive no. Joe started to get a little freaked out and debated calling the police multiple times, but after about 45 minutes, he stopped and everything was quiet again. Feeling uneasy but too tired to stay up, Joe decided to call it a night early. On this night, Joe's dog was with him. She usually would stay at his parents' house when he wasn't home or when he'd leave at night for his photography work. But since he was off that night, she stayed with Joe the whole day. The two got into bed and went to sleep around 11 p.m., and it wasn't until around 4 a.m. that he woke up to the sound of his dog growling. Not a soft growl like when a dog sees a cat. Joe described it as a deep, rough, I'm gonna tear you apart kind of growl. He jumped up and went looking for her, and she was in the kitchen facing the pantry. As Joe rounded the corner, he heard the sound of a door slam in the pantry. However, once he got to the pantry, the door was still open. Joe's dog continued to growl and walked into the pantry and started pushing on the back shelf. Joe went in after her and turned on the light, and he noticed a very small gap between the back shelf and the wall of the pantry, and so he pushed on it, and this revealed a secret room behind the pantry. Joe's dog tried to run inside, but he caught her before she could go too far. There was a small hallway with a drop down at the end of it. Joe didn't go inside though. He called the police immediately. They came and he explained the situation. They went downstairs and got Joe's neighbor to open his door. What they found was disturbing. They found a large hunting knife and a panel missing from a wall in his closet that led to the room in Joe's pantry. The building owner said it was what was left after the renovation that turned the home into 3 units. Joe moved out that week. Shortly upon moving into their new home, a Utah couple found something that wasn't included on the listing for their home. That might sound exciting, but what they found to them was anything but exciting. The couple stumbled across a hidden room in their house, and it looked exactly like a torture dungeon. The couple found the entryway to this hidden den behind a pretty average-looking bookcase in a room that appears to be just an ordinary lounge. The wife/mother said that the bookcase positioned against the wall looked off, so she decided to try and move it elsewhere, and this was when she soon realized that the bookcase was actually secured on and was disguising a secret door that the couple had no idea existed. The room wasn't included on the listing, nor mentioned by the realtor or the previous owners of the home. The woman shared pictures on Reddit showing the stages of her opening the bookcase before revealing the creepy room lurking behind the wall. The image taken relies strictly on the flash from the phone's camera, but it shows the concrete room that contains one random fold-out chair sitting in the middle of the room. Various other objects can be seen around the space that led Reddit users at the time this was posted to speculate that the room could have been used as some kind of torture room, or even used as some kind of bunker for a killer. Of course, Reddit and the internet in general will always come up with wild theories, and while finding this room in your house would definitely be a bit creepy, there's no proof the room was ever used for malicious purposes. The couple later turned the room into a mini gym. However, a much more mysterious Reddit post that was posted 4 years ago in April of 2019 similarly shows a picture of an entrance to a hidden room in somebody's house. The only difference here is the Redditor who posted this never made a follow-up post or uploaded any pictures of what was beyond the door. The Redditor who shared this found this creepy-looking door hidden in his basement, and what made it extra weird was that there was a big metal shelf purposefully blockading the door, as if to deter anybody from entering. The Redditor claimed it was done so by the previous owner. The post contained no additional info, but what makes this whole thing stranger was that this was the last post to ever be made from this Reddit account. This was a pretty active Reddit account before this post. Because of this sudden disappearance after this already mysterious Reddit post, some people speculated that the person did in fact enter the room and found something in there, something that may have led to his disappearance or death. People have tried to find out more details about the Redditor to find out where he lived and find any possible news articles relating to disappearances, but there has been no luck. For now, whatever happened here remains unknown. This next one comes from viewer Milad Hussein, who's a father of a teenage girl currently in military school. Recently, Milad had been cleaning out his house with his buddy Jacob, and suddenly out of nowhere, Jacob started yelling for Milad, saying that he found a small hidden door in his daughter's room. Milad had the permission from his daughter to clean her room before doing so. He was shocked to hear the words hidden door, and so he ran to his daughter's room and found Jacob in the closet. There was where Jacob found a secret doorway, which once opened, led to a stairway that led to a basement area that Milad had no idea of. His landlord never told him about it. Milad included this image of the stairs leading to the small basement. Once they got to the basement, they found themselves in a small room with a horrid smell. So horrid, in fact, that the two men considered leaving the basement altogether. Inside the basement was a small table covered in weird dark red stains with a big book, a total of 28 pens which had no ink left, and a mountain of trash with an old laptop on the table. The two men wondered if someone used to live down there a long time ago simply based off how old the laptop was. Milad then decided to look inside the book, and he was heavily disgusted by its contents. There were writings of somebody's plans to brutally slaughter the bullies from school, and he recognized the handwriting to be that of his daughter. One short passage in the book read, "Goodbye world, goodbye. There's nothing in this world. I'm useless. I have a Glock in my hand while writing this. I will pull the trigger anytime soon. I'm slowly destroying myself. Help me." On another page of the little diary, there was a note that said, "I will rip blank into shreds and drown her in her own blood. I have no remorse for what I'm doing. I am aware that I'm going to murder someone who caused me pain and shame for the past 9 years. You will regret it. Say hello to my new weapons." The third image from the diary he attached was a diagram of her school and her plan on targeting it and her bullies with her friend who was experiencing the same issues as her. Unfortunately, all the images were pretty blurry. I'd say it's safe to assume Milad confronted his daughter after finding these notes, but I was never able to get confirmation from him as he never replied to any of my emails, unfortunately. This last story comes from a viewer named Sal from Hope Mills, North Carolina. In the summer of 2022, he and his friend Connor moved into an upstairs apartment in a two-family home in town. They didn't sign a lease or anything. It was a listing they found on Facebook Marketplace that offered month-to-month rentals. Sal contacted the landlord Tom, who did not live in the house. There was a tenant already living in the downstairs apartment who drove a red pickup truck that was almost always in the driveway. The upstairs apartment was decent, nothing too modern or fancy, but they saw it as a nice temporary place to escape from their parents' houses. The apartment had 2 bedrooms, ample closet space, a living room, 1 bathroom, and a small kitchen. The 2 bedrooms were on opposite sides of the floor, with a long hallway connecting them, and the living room in the middle of the hallway. All of the rooms and the hallway were carpeted. There was a big closet in the hallway that would otherwise be used as a jacket closet, but given that they were only going to be there for the summer, they were going to use this as a small storage closet. Right from the get-go, Sal would feel like he'd be hearing noises coming from above the apartment, usually cracks in the wood that he would keep dismissing for normal house noises. But on one of the first nights in the apartment, right above Sal in his bed, he heard what he was almost positive were footsteps. The cracks in the floor were moving, and they were at a steady pace. Sal went over to Connor's room and knocked on the door to ask him if he was hearing the sounds too, but by this point, the cracks stopped. Sal freaked out Connor with this because they were already on the upper level. Anything above them would be the attic, but they were not told of any attic by the landlord. The next day, Sal texted Tom asking if there were an attic, and Tom replied no there wasn't, and that any sounds that would come from above would just be the pipes. So once again, Sal would dismiss the sounds he heard for house noises. The sounds would continue for a few nights. Then one day, after getting home from work, Sal was home alone. Even the downstairs tenant was out. So even in the seemingly empty house, there were clear as day footstep type sounds coming from above Sal's head. He decided to look around the place for a potential attic door. There were no attic doors in either of the bedrooms or living room. He checked the big closet in the hall, and he noticed something peculiar. There was a hanging plastic garbage bag blocking something. He moved it aside to realize there was a white door, and beyond the door was a stairway leading up to another door. Sal quietly went up the stairs and opened the rickety-looking wooden door at the top, and what was beyond the door was the last thing he ever expected. There was a cramped, unkempt-looking apartment up there. He caught just a glimpse of a small, dirty kitchen, a living room with a small, old sofa, and an open doorway that led into what he presumed to be a bedroom. Sal stated that it smelled like human waste up there, and the unbearable stench was about to chase him out of there anyway, before he heard cracks in the floor come from inside that small bedroom-looking room. Sal quickly left the floor back down the stairs he came up. He locked himself in his room and called 911. When the police got to the house, Sal led them up the stairs and showed them the secret passageway to the secret upstairs floor, and the police found a homeless-looking and smelling man in a small bedroom on the 3rd floor. When Sal told the landlord, he arrived on scene and came clean, explaining that the man on the 3rd floor was his troubled brother, and he needed a place for him to stay. The 3rd floor that was once an attic was secretly converted to a small living space, but it lacked a bathroom, hence the horrid smell. And according to what the police told Sal, there was human feces in the sink up there. Sal and Connor had only been in that apartment for a few days, but that would have meant at some point that man likely came down into their apartment and may have taken food from them. The landlord was arrested for breaching a number of tenant privacy rights, which even without a lease, month-to-month renters are still protected under these laws. Sal and Connor both pressed charges on top of this, and they moved out all of their stuff the same day this happened with the police nearby.
Stories, scary stories. Christmas. No. Oopsie.
When I was newly single after my 2-year relationship ended, I I was back to living alone again, and back to swiping on Tinder and all those apps. I had been single for a few months already, and I had met a few people in that time. During that time, I matched a girl on Tinder named Tracy, and she gave me her Snapchat, but it quickly fizzled out to her just watching my stories and not really communicating. That kind of used to happen all the time when I was in college. But now being in my late 20s, using Tinder, and just being reminded of how immature all this online dating stuff is, it feels a lot different at this age. I own a corner townhome in a little community. If you're wondering what I do, I'm an accountant. Good money, but miserably boring. After my ex moved out, I thought I would be ready for the privacy and peace and quiet, but I'd say after the first month, the novelty of that wore off. Maybe I'm more of a relationship person, or I just need people around, but being alone was getting to me. That's why I was constantly swiping on dating apps and trying to go on dates, just to get out of the house. This was last December. I posted something on my Snap story that had to do with Christmas, and guess who commented on my story? It was that Tracy girl who I hadn't spoken to in weeks. She struck up a conversation about us doing some Christmas-themed stuff together, and from there we started chatting for a bit. I suggested the most festive things I could think of: ice skating, going to the village, and looking at the decorations, but she suggested we decorate my Christmas tree. Firstly, I did have a fake tree, but it was up in the attic, so I told her I didn't have it up yet because it's kind of a two-person job getting it out of the attic. She said she'd gladly come over and help, so I figured why not. I told her to come over around 9 that night. It was already dark at that point when we made the plan. It was likely like 7:30 because I remember hurriedly grabbing my keys and rushing to drive to the liquor store to buy a couple bottles of wine. When I got back to the house, I vacuumed and swept the floors. Ever since my breakup, the things my girlfriend would do to clean the place were left to me, and I realized how quickly a place can get dirty. 9 p.m. rolled around, and I was low-key sitting upright on the couch with the TV on, pretending like I was just chilling in the living room watching a movie already. Meanwhile, I had set everything up to be cozy and relaxing, but I sat there for a while, waiting on her to message me or for the doorbell. I sent a follow-up saying, "Let me know when you're on your way," and I eventually started to think she was flaking, until finally, around 9:30, when she said she's outside. She came inside, and I was shocked to find that I was looking up at her. She was a couple inches taller than me. I'm 5'10", so she had to be at least 6 feet tall. I also immediately picked up on the fact that she smelled like she was drenched in perfume. We went straight to the couch and sat down, and she sat really, really close to me, like our legs were touching. This is where I started to get confused in how exactly I was feeling. She looked a bit older, maybe a little rougher, I'm not sure how to explain it. And underneath that overpowering smell of cheap-smelling perfume, I couldn't help but feel like there was a slight hint of body odor, which completely turned me off. I asked her if she wanted wine, and she said yes please. So I went and poured a couple glasses as we talked. Have you ever met someone for the first time that you'd been texting or DMing for a while, and when you finally meet, they just end up being nothing like you pictured in your head? That was pretty much this. Something about her felt off, like she lacked certain social cues. I handed her a glass of Merlot, and we cheers each other. I shit you not, she almost immediately spilled a huge drop of red wine on my light blue couch. I composed myself, but I wanted to scream. I said it's okay, as I ran to the kitchen to get a damp paper towel and sponge. I ran back to the couch and blotted it as quickly as I could before it would settle. She kept apologizing, and I kept saying it was okay. After this, it got a little more tense, and to break the tension, I suggested I get the tree out of the attic. So I went up to the attic, slid over the giant box with all the tree parts in it, and started handing her down the pieces one by one, each piece getting bigger until we got to the biggest part, the part that I wouldn't be able to handle going down the ladder on my own. She grabbed it with ease. I had to remember this girl's size. Once everything was handed down, I went back down and we assembled the tree in the living room with Christmas music playing. I poured her more wine and I drank more myself. I loosened up a bit more. Wine makes any situation feel better. Once we had the tree set up, next was the ornaments. I told her my ornaments were all in the crawl space. These ornaments were all from my childhood. My parents gave me bins and bins of Christmas decorations. So I went down to the crawl space and one by one started taking out the bins, while I left Tracy in the living room to relax. As I was doing all of this, I started feeling woozy, like the wine was getting to my head. I've never been a heavy drinker, so I do have a low tolerance, but I felt like I hadn't drank that much to feel this way. I grabbed the first bin and started lugging it up the stairs.
Di perfume.
By the time I got to the top, Tracy wasn't anywhere in sight. I assumed she was in the bathroom at first and called her name. I looked around each room and then saw that the bathroom was empty. I scratched my head in confusion as I kept calling her name. I went to message her on Snap, but she never opened the Snap. I checked the 2 bedrooms too, but she was gone. I couldn't believe this. She snuck out on me. This was when I started wondering if she thought I was ugly or weird or something, even though truthfully, I wasn't even really into her either. I crashed onto the couch, which suddenly felt a lot more comfortable than before, and honestly, as far as I remember, I periodically checked my phone to see if she opened my Snap and just watched whatever was on TV, until my memory just faded to black. I swear, everything just went black. And then I woke up in darkness. No lights, no TV on. I looked around in the dark room, and I knew I was hearing things. I felt like I was still on the couch, and I felt weak. My limbs were hard to move, but I managed to find my phone right under me within seconds, and I checked the time. The second the phone screen lit up, I saw it. Even though the light was facing toward me, that glow from my phone screen with the brightness all the way up revealed the outline of a tall person's silhouette standing in front of me. For some reason, I didn't scream. I just put the phone down, bringing the room back to darkness. I finally opened my mouth to say, "Tracy," hoping it was her, but still not in that moment remembering what had happened earlier. Whoever was standing there didn't answer me. I eventually picked my phone back up and turned on the flashlight, and I saw that it was in fact Tracy standing in front of me. She wasn't moving, she was just looking down at me. I felt locked to the couch. I don't know if it was because of pure fear or the effects of whatever she had obviously laced me with. I genuinely was having a hard time moving my limbs. I felt weak and helpless. All I could manage to say was "Tracy" a couple more times. She turned towards the stairs, and again, I swear, she sprinted toward them, and all I heard were the disturbingly loud stomps of her running down the stairs. I heard something slam from downstairs. Looking back, I'd imagine it was the front door. Everything looked and sounded so wonky in those minutes after I woke up. Each passing minute, I felt more and more clear-headed, and moving became easier. I checked Snapchat to see that her account was gone, aka she blocked me. I looked out the front window and saw no cars outside besides my own and the neighbors. And then I realized I never saw the vehicle that she arrived in, or if she even arrived in one. I checked my entire home from top to bottom, checking for anything that could have been stolen. The only items I found missing seemed kind of bizarre at first, but honestly made so much sense soon after. Every last bottle of pills from my house was gone. All my vitamins and supplements, my bottles of Adderall, and even the bottle of Oxy that I had prescribed but never fully used after a surgery, those were in the drawer next to my bed. I noticed a bottle of vodka was taken from my mini fridge in my room too, but other than that, I didn't see anything else that could have been stolen. Still, I called the police right then and reported the robbery. I gave the Snapchat username and explained that I never got her number or knew anything really about her identity minus the name that she gave me, which was Tracy Gibson. The police knocked on my neighbor's door since all of our homes are attached, even though it was like 1 a.m. With me standing next to them, they questioned if he'd seen or heard anything strange, to which he said no, he'd been asleep. After about 20 minutes, the police left. I made sure all of my keys were still in place so as to make sure she couldn't get back in. But other than that, this Tracy person disappeared without a trace. I knew her behavior was quirky and wonky from the first few minutes of meeting her, and it makes so much sense now. I won't even call it a theory because I just know this is the truth. I think that girl, or woman I should say, was older than she claimed, and she was potentially homeless with a serious drug addiction. I think she drowned herself in perfume to mask the body odor that was honestly still showing through. She laced my wine with something when I was in the attic, clearly. I don't know exactly how long I was out, but it was enough for her to scour my entire home for any and all drugs and supplements. I still remember how disturbing of an image it was seeing her tall silhouette standing in front of me while I was just waking up on the couch. Honestly, after this, I didn't even decorate the tree that year.
Good story. Oh, come on, move.
This happened on Christmas Eve back in '97 when I was 7 years old. Since we're Jewish, we don't celebrate Christmas, so Christmas Eve was just like any other night for us. Our dad is a doctor, and since he's Jewish, he always works on call at the hospital during the Christmas holidays, so he wasn't home tonight. That just left my little sister and I by ourselves for the evening while our dad worked. Technically, our mom was home, but to be blunt, she was an alcoholic.
Oh,
Back then, being a 7-year-old, I had no idea what alcoholism was. All I knew was that my mom was always passed out once it got dark and near impossible to wake up. Sorry if it sounds harsh or TMI, but it's relevant to my story. My sister and I were downstairs watching TV when we heard a knock at the door. Being the oldest, I went to see who it was. Our door had glass panes built into it, which made it easy to see who was on the other side. There was a man standing outside in a Santa suit holding a bag, and when he saw me, he smiled and waved at me to come to the door. I went near the door but did not open it, and I thought it was odd that someone dressed like Santa would come to our house out of anyone's house in the neighborhood. He said, "Hey kid, it's me Santa. Let me in, I'll give you your presents." I remember point blank telling him that Santa isn't real, and that if he was, he doesn't give Jews presents anyway. That's when he said, "Of course I'm real." In the past, I only used to visit Christian homes, but lately, I felt bad that Jewish kids never get any presents. So this year, I changed the rules so that you can get presents too. But I didn't buy it, and instead, I remember getting mad at him, arguing that Jews get presents. We just get them during Hanukkah and not on Christmas. The smile fell from his face, and all his jolly charm disappeared as he began demanding I open the door. I told my sister to dial 911, and the guy seemed to run away. We did call the cops. However, unfortunately, the operator didn't understand what we were saying. Looking back, I think she may have thought we were just little kids excited that Santa Claus was coming to our house. Regardless, she didn't take us seriously, and instead just told us that this number was to be used for emergencies only before disconnecting the call. My sister and I now got really scared because we didn't know who else to call. Since we were only 4 and 7, the only numbers we knew how to dial were our home number and 911. And since this is the 90s, my dad didn't have a cell phone yet, and I had no idea what the hospital number was to reach him there. And with our mom impossible for us to wake up, we were essentially on our own. We hoped the man wouldn't come back, but a few minutes later, he was knocking on the door again. He said he knew the cops weren't coming and to go ahead and let him in or we'd be in big trouble. My sister started crying and ran upstairs trying to wake my mom. Not knowing what else to do, I did the one thing that made sense to my 7-year-old brain. I grabbed a bunch of candles we keep for our menorah and lit them all, then ran below where the smoke detector was. I blew out all the candles quickly before tossing them all up to the smoke detector. Thankfully, they gave off enough smoke to set off the smoke alarm. As an adult, I realized how stupid this was, and fortunately, I did not accidentally set the house on fire. But at that time, all I knew was that the smoke alarm would instantly call 911 for me and send help to our home. There was a fire department not even 2 minutes from our house, so they got here pretty fast. My sister came downstairs, scared of the fire alarm, but I told her there was no fire and to not go outside, but instead wait inside with me. To my amazement, the guy still did not leave. Instead, the bastard ran to the firefighters, presumably telling them that he was glad they showed up. I remember that he claimed he was my dad, and that he dressed up like Santa Claus for Christmas Eve to surprise us. He explained that his suit didn't have any pockets to hold his keys, and that with the door locked, he couldn't get the door open to save us from the fire, so he begged the firefighters to break down the door, and surprisingly, the firefighters seemed to believe him. They were actually getting ready to break down the door, and told us to stand back, but we started crying, shouting at them that he's not our dad, that our dad is working at the hospital and that we have no idea who this guy was, and that we don't even celebrate Christmas. The firefighter who was about to break down the door thankfully stopped and listened to us. He asked, "You don't celebrate Christmas?" I told him no because we're Jewish, and showed him my kippah on my head as well as our menorah. I then broke down crying, explaining how I set off the smoke alarm to try and get help because the police wouldn't believe us, and to please not let the guy in. The firefighter thankfully believed me, and then asked the guy why Santa would show up to a Jewish home. I don't remember exactly what the guy said, but the firefighters clearly didn't believe him. 2 of them wrestled the guy to the ground while the other called the police to come by. They also asked what hospital my dad worked at so they could let him know what was going on. The police arrived and arrested the guy, while another officer stayed with us until my dad came home and explained the situation to him. My dad was furious with our mom for being wasted and essentially sleeping through the whole thing, but mostly he was grateful that we were okay. As far as Christmases go, I was glad to have our usual boring and quiet Christmas the following year. To this day, I think being Jewish saved my sister and I's lives, because had we opened that door to let Santa in, there's a good chance that would have been our final Christmas.
Probably.
It was December 2022. My girlfriend Charlotte and I were driving to the Pocono Mountains. We had rented a super cozy looking Airbnb decked out with Christmas decorations. And it was nicely located with a nice view, big property, and not far from a cute little village. To make things even more festive feeling, there was a snowstorm coming that night, so we set out on the road a little earlier to allow us time to get groceries and everything set up in the Airbnb. From the city to the Poconos was about 4 hours. We made decent time. We stopped at a Family Dollar for some snacks and groceries, and then we went straight to the Airbnb. We turned towards the uphill gravel road through a clearing in the trees that led to the property. The house was surrounded by woods. It had a big deck with a hot tub on it, which was very appealing, especially the idea of sitting in it during a snowstorm. There were a bunch of Christmas decorations on the property, including some light-up reindeer, a big snowman, and big decorative candy canes lining the walkway to the front deck. We had to take a few trips to and from the car to bring everything inside. First impression, the place had a very comfy feeling as we expected from the pictures. It had a Christmas tree in one corner, stockings hung on the walls, and a bunch of smaller decorations scattered about. It had that very welcoming smell of wood that you'd expect in a country log cabin, though it was more so just a regular house. Then I realized why. There was a stack of logs next to a big fireplace in the living room. There were 3 bedrooms, though of course we only needed 1. We put our luggage and such in a second bedroom. I did the usual stuff like inspect the fridge, turn on the TV to see if there's cable or Netflix, and look out all the windows. There was an upstairs, but it was more of a loft with a pool table and a couple of couches. Then there was a basement. For the hell of it, I went down to check out the basement. It was fairly big relative to the size of the house. It felt disconnected from the Airbnb though. It wasn't furnished for hanging out in. It was dark and cold and felt more like a space to do laundry and a workspace. Then there was a knock at the front door. I hurried up to answer it, and there was a guy who looked to be in his late 40s. He was wearing gray sweatpants and a ripped up yellowish brown jacket. He smiled at me and said, "How are you folks doing?" I replied good and asked him if he was the Airbnb host. He replied he runs the place with his brother. I asked for his name, and he said Tom. Tom said he lives just up the road next door if my girl and I need anything. I thanked him, and then he walked away. I found it interesting that he knew I was with my girlfriend. Charlotte didn't come to the door, but maybe his brother told him about us. I did have a conversation with Mike, the host, about it being my girlfriend and I wanting to do something festive. It was pitch black out and it was snowing. We cranked up the heat in the house and started preparing the dinner we bought, which was chicken thighs, broccoli, potatoes, and cornbread. It was pretty grab bag. We ate on the couch with the Christmas tree lights on in the corner, giving the room a nice comfy glow as we watched the Polar Express. It was the only good Christmas movie on any of the streaming platforms. If you can't tell, we really love Christmas. After the movie, and when we felt we had digested enough, we went outside to the deck to hop in the hot tub. I turned on all the decorations and Christmas lights in the front yard, and as we sat in the hot tub watching the snowfall, it felt like bliss, until the bubbles on the hot tub stopped and it went silent. We heard unmistakable footsteps from somewhere on the property. Charlotte and I looked at one another. I asked her if I should shout who's there, but she said no. The footsteps moved further and further until they were no longer audible. I told Charlotte it was probably a deer, but deep down I knew those were the footsteps of a person. After the hot tub, we went to take a shower before bed. The hot water in the shower didn't last for more than maybe 2 minutes though. Something was wrong. When the water turned ice cold, we screamed and jumped out of the shower. I messaged Mike, the host, about it. He responded within half an hour saying that's odd and that he'll have a guy come and look at the hot water heater tomorrow. We went to sleep after our half shower. In the middle of the night, though, we awoke to very aggressive bangs on the front door of the house. Charlotte was shaking me, terrified. I said I'm gonna check who it is, but she demanded I stay in the bed and don't make a sound. Honestly, I was glad she said that. No part of me wanted to know who was at the door in the middle of the night. I think there were 3 sets of really loud and angry sounding bangs before they stopped. We sat upright for a few minutes in silence, whispering to each other. I went over to lock the bedroom door for added security, I guess. Minutes dragged along, but ultimately, after about half an hour of sitting wide awake, we eventually drifted back off to sleep. First thing in the morning, I messaged Mike again about the knocks at the door. He answered more quickly this time, seeming pretty confused like us. He basically said how strange that is. He didn't know why anyone would be roaming around late at night like that. He said if anything like that happens again, that we should alert the authorities. Honestly, not the most reassuring response, but I mean, he was right. What else could he tell us? Grab a gun and shoot whoever was at the door? I didn't want to keep complaining to Mike constantly, but I mean, these were some valid concerns I was bringing up to him. There was a lot of snow outside, and it was a dark, cloudy day. There were still some flurries falling onto the ground. I went out to wipe the snow off my Jeep, and while I was doing so, I noticed footsteps in the snow. They looped around the house. I remembered the knocks from the night before, and wondered if it was from the same person, but these footprints looked fresh, and it snowed all night. Surely the footprints from last night would have filled in by now. I heard footsteps approaching now, actually, and I saw Tom walking from around my car. I told him about the hot water heater problem, and that Mike said they were sending someone to take a look at it. He said he knew and that he was here to take a look at it, actually. I also told him about the knocks at the door last night and the footprints in the snow. I even showed him. He looked at them and said there's a lot of strange folk out here that go snooping around at night. I asked if we should refrain from using the hot tub at night then, and he said no, that shouldn't be a problem. The people around here are harmless. He went inside into the house and walked around for a bit before walking down to the basement. He told me he'll have a look at the hot water heater. Tom seems like a weird dude, honestly. I messaged Mike saying Tom's here now checking out the water heater. Mike replied back asking, is Tom the name of the plumber? And I replied, no, your brother. He replied, what do you mean? He said he's my brother? It started to click in my head. I responded, do you have a brother named Tom who runs this Airbnb with you? And he replied, no, who is this person? I hurried to Charlotte and told her to collect her things quietly. We need to get out of here. As quickly as we could, we packed our bags, grabbed all of our stuff, and brought it outside to the car in one trip. I'm sure we left behind a charger or something small, but who cares? We got in my car, and when I started it, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw Tom quickly approaching the rear of the Jeep. I put it in drive and drove out of there as quickly as I could. When we were back on the road, we called Mike and explained everything and told him he needs to call the police now. He didn't stay on the line with us for long, but 20 minutes later, he called us back. We were in the car still. He said the police were there now and didn't see anyone in the house. Mike was on his way to the house as well, but he was mostly calling to get more details from us. We drove around the area and explored just as a way to calm our nerves after what just happened. After a few hours, we drove home. Mike messaged me later that night updating me and apologizing for everything. He said he didn't know anyone who resembled my description of Tom. What disturbs me is that man was watching us the entire time, from the moment we arrived to when we were in the hot tub, and he was probably the one banging on the front door in the middle of the night. Who knows what his intentions were? It's a good thing we left when we did, though.
Story. New house horror stories.
This is one of my favorite topics that I've covered in the past. New house stories in which unsuspecting people who just moved into their new homes discover something or perhaps someone that shouldn't be there. But before getting into those, I want to thank DraftKings for sponsoring this video. DraftKings is an online, real money casino that lets you play whenever and wherever legally permitted. DraftKings is an industry leader with a variety of popular slots games, exclusive DraftKings games, and live dealer table games. With the holidays around the corner, DraftKings can be your home casino for the holidays, with your favorite real money casino games right at your fingertips in the comfort of your living room by the Christmas tree and fireplace. Choose from over 300 real money games, slots, blackjack, roulette, and live dealer games. With more real money games added regularly, DraftKings Casino is changing the game with new ways to play. DraftKings is safe, secure, and reliable, and if it's not yet available in your state, check out DraftKings Daily Fantasy app, where you have a shot at winning cash prizes all season long. Head to the DraftKings Casino app right now and sign up using promo code Mr. Nightmare, and when you play just $10, you'll instantly receive $100 in casino credits.
Okay. Story 1.
This happened a few years ago, but it still gives me an unsettling feeling whenever I think about it. The only reason I'm talking about it now is because I feel like it's been long enough since it happened, and I won't risk anything by putting it on the internet. Back then, my wife and I had just moved into the suburbs from the city. We just had our third kid, and between the baby stuff, the toys, and the general chaos, our apartment felt way too cramped. We found a nice house in a quiet, safe neighborhood. The neighbors described it as the kind of place where you'd feel fine leaving the doors unlocked. The house itself wasn't massive, but it was definitely a step up from the tiny space we'd previously been living in. One of the features that caught my wife's eye was the backyard. It had this beautiful, slightly overgrown garden with a few old statues scattered around. They were weathered, a little eerie looking, like something out of Game of Thrones. I know it sounds weird, but my wife and I loved it, said it gave our yard character. I was pretty indifferent, so I left everything as it was, statues and all. I figured it was less work for me, which I was never going to complain about. A few days after we moved in, I was looking out the window, taking in the yard, when I noticed something odd. One of the statues, an angel I think, was facing away from the house. All the others were facing toward us, so it looked strange. I could have sworn they all faced the same direction, but I didn't really know for sure. I didn't think much of it, and just assumed I was misremembering things. The next morning, I looked out the window again, and that's when I noticed it. Another statue had turned around, again facing away from the house. This time, I knew something was up. I had never been more sure about anything in my life. I asked my wife about it, but she just shrugged it off and said she hadn't noticed anything. I thought maybe it was my son Jimmy. He was a little prankster back then, always up to something. But when I asked him, he just looked at me like I was nuts. I doubted he'd do something like that anyway. I knew something was going on though, but I couldn't prove it. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, so I tried to ignore it. Besides, I had bigger problems to worry about. I don't like admitting it, but money was really tight during that time. I lived in perpetual fear that I was going to lose my job. A few days went by without anything strange, and I started to relax. But then, one evening, I looked out the window, and my heart nearly stopped. All of the statues were lined up in a row at the very edge of the house, just standing there. It was a freakish sight, like something out of a horror movie. I know it sounds ridiculous, but part of me could feel all those eyes looking at me. My breathing went shallow. I couldn't decide whether it was more scary or bizarre. I went outside to get a closer look, trying to make sense of it. Before opening up the back door, I took a few nervous glances around the yard to make sure there was no one out there. It was daylight, but I was paranoid. Eventually, I worked up the courage to open the door and go inspect the statues. I went to lift one of them and immediately realized something. Those statues were heavy, way too heavy for one person to move alone. I couldn't even budge one of them on my own. As I was debating what to do, my wife came outside, and the look on her face told me she was just as freaked out as I was. She suggested maybe some of the other neighbors were messing with us, trying to scare the new people on the block, but that explanation literally made no sense. We had met all of the neighbors, and they all seemed like fairly normal people. Plus, I had trouble believing that anyone sane would do this to a family with young children. This was harassment, not some harmless prank.
Naive.
We ended up calling the police, but as you might expect, they couldn't do much. They suggested putting up some security cameras, but we didn't have the money for that. I told the cops we would, but on the inside, I was really reluctant to do something so drastic. They left, and I guess I felt a little better, even though my wife was still extremely shaken up. My wife and I did everything we could to hide the situation from our kids. Say what you will, but we didn't want to scare them. Nothing happened the next day, or the next. I speculated that the cops had scared whoever was there away, which did track on many levels. So we tried to forget about it, even though neither of us really felt comfortable. I tried to assure myself that maybe my wife was right. Maybe it had just been a prank or something. That didn't do anything to calm my nerves, though. I was on edge, looking out the windows every time I passed by, half expecting to see the statues somewhere else. I hope no one ever has to experience the sensation of feeling unsafe in your own home. A few days passed without incident. I started thinking the nightmare was over, and for the first time in a while, the house was actually starting to feel like home. I could not have been more wrong. It was a weekend. I don't remember whether it was Saturday or Sunday, but it was definitely a weekend since my kids didn't have school. After some breakfast, I went outside to play in the yard with my kids, and that's when I saw it. Spray painted in big black letters on the back wall of our house were the words, "Go away." I nearly dropped my son when I saw it. Without thinking, I rushed my kids inside and told my wife to stay in the house with them. I don't know what came over me. I'm not that brave of a guy, but I started sprinting through the garden, screaming threats at whoever had vandalized my house. Adrenaline was coursing through my veins, and I was looking for a fight. No one was anywhere in my yard, though. Eventually, I gave up looking. As I was walking back towards the house, the adrenaline in me turned to outright fear. This was serious. Someone had left a direct message meant to scare us. They could have meant us harm, and I knew the situation was only going to escalate from there. The police came again and took down another report, but without any leads, there wasn't much they could do. I insisted that they stay on the property in case those people came back, but they told me they didn't have enough evidence to waste resources like that. As far as they knew, some teenage delinquents could have been behind the graffiti. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They told me they'd make sure a patrol officer was nearby, which I guess was some kind of consolation. My wife was twice as upset as I was, so I reassured her that we'd be okay, even though I was freaking out internally. That night, I was in the kitchen, and I heard my wife scream from the living room. I ran in, and she was standing by the window pointing outside. I looked, and my stomach dropped. There were 5 people standing in our backyard, each of them wearing white face coverings. They were dancing around in this strange, jerky way, almost like puppets. We just stood there, watching them, too shocked to move. It was terrifying. I don't know what they were trying to accomplish, but it was the most disturbing thing I'd ever seen. I snapped out of my haze and grabbed the biggest kitchen knife we had. I basically screamed at my wife to call the police, and while she was doing that, I ran out the back door with a knife in my hand. I screamed like a clinically insane person and took one step toward them before instantly regretting it. There were 5 of them and 1 of me. They could have been armed. Before anything else could happen, I turned and ran back inside the house like a coward. The knife must have scared them, though, because they stopped dancing and ran into the garden, out of sight. I told my wife to run upstairs, find the kids, and hide, and I guarded the back door in case they tried to break in. By the time the police arrived, those people were gone. The police did a thorough search, but couldn't find any trace of them. That was the last straw. I didn't care about the costs. I bought and installed security cameras the next day. My wife was hysterical for weeks after that, begging me to let us move somewhere else. I told her that if one more thing happens, that we would, but that we'd probably be screwing ourselves financially if it came to that. Luckily, the cameras must have done the trick, because those people never returned, and we never had another incident occur on the property. The scariest thing, though, is that we still live in the same house, and never got an explanation for what happened.
Crazy people. Crazy people.
My wife Taylor and I recently moved out of our old home. She didn't like being so close to her family and wanted to put some distance between us and them. So that's what we did. We don't have kids, and she stopped working ages ago, so she was relatively amenable to my suggestions about where to move. I'm an electrician, so bouncing around isn't much of a problem for me. We eventually settled on New Mexico. We've both been rural people all our lives, so it wasn't that drastic of a lifestyle change. That was about 3 months ago, give or take. We found a fantastic deal on a place way out in the country. The house is honestly bigger than we really need, especially since it's just the two of us and our black lab Lola. But honestly, we figured we'd make use out of the extra space, maybe even host some of the friends we'd make. We'd been settled in for a few months when I started noticing something odd. The upstairs lights kept tripping circuits, but the rest of the house would still have power. After this happened once or twice, I knew exactly what the problem was. Like I said, I'm literally an electrician, so this kind of stuff is my bread and butter. I figured it would be an easy fix, just a matter of rearranging some of the load on the breaker, which in all likelihood was downstairs. Times like those make me happy that I'm the type of guy who knows how to fix things. To be honest, I hadn't spent that much time in the basement since we moved in. I didn't really have a reason to. We'd looked it over briefly when the realtor showed us the place, but I didn't pay much attention. Come to think of it, I don't think I'd been in there one time since then. Anyway, I walked down the stairs and started looking around for the main breaker. The basement was pretty cluttered and definitely not the type of space that could be easily used. It looked more like a storage room than a basement. Eventually, I figured out where the main was and started futzing around. After about 10 minutes, I realized where the load imbalance was and told myself I'd rewire it when I had more time. At that point, I was about to go upstairs when curiosity got the better of me. I figured since I was down in the basement already, it probably wouldn't be a bad idea to have a look around. After all, this is my house. It was honestly a little strange that I didn't know every square inch of it. Like I said, most of it was filled with old furniture and a bunch of junk. There wasn't anything particularly interesting down there, and I eventually concluded that trying to transform it into a usable space would be way too much of a hassle. That's when I noticed something odd. In the far corner of the basement, behind a stack of old wooden chairs, was a large metal door. It was strange because this wasn't just any door. It looked industrial grade. It was also a lot taller than most normal doors would be, and seemed pretty thick too. I walked over to it, and my suspicions were confirmed. It looked like the type of door you'd see securing a walk-in safe or some kind of panic room. My first thought was maybe it was a tornado shelter or storm room or something, but that would be a weird surprise. You'd think the realtor would have mentioned a feature like that. I tried to open it, but the handle wouldn't budge. It was locked. I immediately went upstairs and started rummaging through the drawer of keys the previous owner had left behind in case we locked ourselves out or something, but none of them worked on the door. I must have tried like 15 keys or something, but no luck. I eventually told Taylor about it, and she was just as curious about it as I was. I'm still not sure how, but she worked her magic, and we were able to get in contact with the previous owners. It was that exact phone call that took me from curious about the situation to downright concerned. They were a little odd on the phone and would pause every so often, like they were thinking carefully about what they were saying or trying not to say too much. Part of me wishes I had recorded the conversation, but hindsight is 20/20. When I asked about the door, they got quiet. Eventually, the wife said it was just a safe room in case of a tornado. I told her that was great, but we were unable to use it since it was locked. After another pause, she claimed they'd lost the key and told us to just ignore it. I thought that was extremely unlikely, since they had literally left us keys to random doors that we'd probably never need to lock. The way she said it gave me a really bad feeling in my gut too, but there was nothing I could do. We ended up hanging up almost immediately after that, as they were definitely not trying to make small talk. Taylor tried to laugh it off, told me I was overthinking it, but I couldn't let it go. Over the course of the next few weeks, I would occasionally wander down the stairs and just stare at that door, wondering what could be inside. I tried everything I could think of to open it, even some tricks I'd picked up from work, but it was no use. The lock was solid. I ended up giving up for about a week, but the curiosity ultimately got the better of me. Fast forward to 2 days ago, when things took a wild turn. After my wife's wishes, I decided to hire a locksmith. He came over, and I let him do his thing down there. After about 30 minutes, I went downstairs to check on him. He told me that the lock was unusually complex for a simple panic room. Those were his exact words. I was worried he wouldn't be able to get it open, but to my surprise, he actually managed to crack it after another half hour. I wish he hadn't. Inside, the room was set up like some kind of shrine. There were old black and white photographs on the walls, all covered in strange symbols that I didn't recognize. In the center was a chair, just facing the wall. It looked like someone had spent a lot of time sitting there, just staring at nothing. In one corner, there was a cot with crumpled blankets, and it smelled stale and kind of gross. Then I noticed the trash. Empty chip bags, crumpled water bottles. The realization smacked me in the face. Someone had actually been staying down there, and not that long ago. I was dumbfounded. I didn't think the situation could get much worse. But of course, that's what happened. As I was trying to take it all in, I noticed a second door on the far right side of the room. It was small and half hidden by the minimal light, but it was there. I opened it and realized it led to a set of stairs that led to the cellar door outside the house. I felt like such an idiot. I hadn't even had the foresight to check the cellar door when we moved in, since I just assumed it led to the basement. In all the time we'd lived here, I had never even opened it. My bewilderment at the whole thing soon became terror. Someone had literally been living in my house for who knows how long. Things started clicking in my brain. Since moving in, my wife and I had noticed a few weird things that we couldn't explain. Most of the time it was just things going missing. Until that point, I had just assumed my wife had misplaced things, which she did have a tendency to do. This discovery changed everything though. Someone had been living in our house. I had to repeat that thought a dozen times in my head before I could fully wrap my mind around what was going on. I didn't know who had been in there or why, but I knew I didn't want them coming back. I tried calling the previous owners, demanding an explanation, maybe even threatening legal action, but they wouldn't pick up. Either they disconnected their number or they just didn't want to deal with it. Taylor was freaked out, and I was too. That night, I took some heavy furniture and barricaded the cellar door from the inside. I found a heavy-duty looking chain and padlocked it shut for good measure. I didn't care what it took. There was no way I was letting someone sneak back in through that door. The police came and took down a full report before leaving, telling us they'd do their best to try and get in contact with the previous owners. We even called our realtor, who was horrified and said she'd assist the police in any way she could. That night, as we were getting ready for bed, we heard it. There was a loud bang on the front door. Lola shot up, barking like crazy, and we both froze. Neither of us moved, just staring at each other, listening. After a few minutes, the banging stopped, but then we heard small rocks tapping against our bedroom window. Taylor held on to Lola, and I went to look out the window. Taylor begged me not to, but I was furious at that point. In my mind, I was preparing to fight whoever was out there. I grabbed the baseball bat from under the bed and yanked the curtains away from the window, but I couldn't see a thing. We thought it was over. Taylor wanted me to call the police, but there was a little part of me that wanted to handle this myself. I knew the police would scare them away. Call it pettiness, but I wanted to make sure whoever was out there got caught. I told her if one more thing happened, I'd call. But then from downstairs, I heard the sound of glass shattering. I sprinted downstairs just in time to see two figures running away from the house. The kitchen window was completely shattered. It was then that I called the police, who showed up not long after. They searched the house and the basement, but there was no sign of forced entry into the storm room. They didn't find anyone on the property either. Their best guess was that whoever had been living down there was angry when they realized they were locked out and decided to come back and scare us. I was both furious and horrified. My wife has been a wreck ever since. The police escalated the situation since an actual crime happened and said they're working on tracking down the previous owners, but that it could take a few days. That was 2 full days ago, and we still have not been able to get in contact with them. I think the police scared away those squatters though, at least for now, as they haven't been back to our house since. I'm actually shocked that something like this could even happen in the first place. If we can't get in contact with the previous owners soon, I have absolutely no idea what I'm gonna do. I'm fully prepared to defend myself, but I hope it doesn't come to that.
What the...
When I bought my first house, I was only 27. I'd saved up for years, and even though it was just a small, modest place, I was proud of it. Moving in, though, that took some adjustment. I'd lived with my parents my whole life, along with 3 siblings and 2 dogs. The house was loud, always buzzing with life. But this was quiet, really quiet. That was honestly the hardest part about the transition, the lack of noise. Living alone felt strange, and at first, I wasn't sure I'd ever get used to it. I'm sure anyone who's gone from living with family to living alone knows what I'm talking about. One thing I loved about the house was the tiny balcony on the 2nd floor. Don't get the wrong impression. I don't even know if I can really even call it a balcony. It was barely big enough to stand on, and I couldn't even fit a chair out there. Regardless, I'd go out there most nights after work to take a break and clear my head. I smoked pretty often, but I hated the smell, so smoking inside wasn't an option for me. The balcony was twice as beneficial for that exact reason. I didn't even have to go outside or leave the comfort of my own home just to smoke. It felt like a luxury. I'll describe the layout of the property so what I'm about to tell you makes sense. The block I lived on was pretty standard, with houses adjacent to each other all the way down. The street behind mine was exactly the same, meaning everyone's house would be sharing a backyard if it weren't for the 10-foot-tall fences designating the property lines. From my balcony, I could see over my backyard neighbor's fence and into his yard. You could see the whole place, really. After a few weeks, I realized I'd met almost all the neighbors except him. Come to think of it, I don't think I had ever seen him, let alone have a conversation with him. The guy never waved and never came over. I never saw him in the yard or at the bedroom window. Nothing. It was like he didn't exist. If it weren't for the occasional bedroom light on at night, I would have assumed the place was deserted. I guessed that there was an old person living there since the grass looked like it hadn't been cut in years, and I never heard any sounds from their yard. After another week, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to go introduce myself and at least put a face to the name. One Saturday, I walked around the block to his place, expecting to knock on the door and maybe make some small talk. But the house looked rough. Rough was an understatement. It looked completely untouched. The yard was a mess, overgrown with weeds, and the whole place looked like it had been ignored for years. The paint was chipping, some of the siding had been scratched off, and the walkway was stained. The doorbell was broken, so I gave a few loud knocks and waited. Nothing. I felt awkward standing there and started to wonder if maybe the place really was vacant. But then I saw a slight movement behind the window shade. Just a flicker, like someone was peeking out. That was enough for me. Someone was in there, spying on me, but wouldn't open the door for some reason. I turned to leave, when all of a sudden, the door flew open, slamming against the wall like someone had ripped it open in a violent rage. I jumped back, totally thrown off. I whipped around and found myself face to face with an elderly Asian woman standing in the doorway, staring at me. She was short, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her skin was wrinkled, but somehow tense, like she was flexing her face muscles, if that even makes sense. Her eyes were wide, unsettlingly wide. I can't even lie, I was pretty freaked out just looking at her. There was something off about her, like it looked like she was on something. She didn't say a word, just stared with no expression on her face. Eventually, I cleared my throat and introduced myself as her new neighbor. After a few seconds, she said her name was Priscilla and gave me a half smile. And that was it. She didn't even ask my name, she just stood there watching me. I nodded and turned away, not knowing what to say. I left feeling more unnerved than I wanted to admit. I never heard the door close behind me, but I didn't want to turn around and get caught looking. Later that night, I went out to my balcony like usual, trying to forget about the strange interaction. At that point, I had no idea of the ordeal that I had just gotten myself into. When I glanced over the railing, there she was, that crazy-looking lady from earlier, standing dead center in her yard, looking straight up at my house. She didn't move, didn't call out, just stood there staring. It was one of those moments where you wonder if you're actually seeing what you think you're seeing. I didn't know if I should say something, wave, or pretend like I hadn't noticed her. It was one of the freakiest things I'd ever seen, and I didn't know how to handle it. I went back inside and told myself she was just a little messed up in the head, and that I shouldn't be getting worked up over a harmless old lady. But it didn't stop there. The following night, I saw her again.
Oh my god.
This time, She was moving from one window to another inside her house, watching me from each one. Although I pretended not to notice her, part of me felt like she knew that I knew she was watching. I was hoping she'd stop, but she didn't. She was still looking at me when I finished smoking and turned to go inside. Out of curiosity, I peeked out one of my windows about 20 minutes later to see if she was still looking at my house. To my horror, she actually was. I called my dad, and he told me that she probably had dementia or something, and that she was most likely just lonely or confused. He told me that I should actually feel bad for her. It was kind of hard to feel bad for someone who was borderline stalking me, but my dad calmed my nerves and assured me that she was harmless. A few nights passed without anything weird happening. I didn't see her in her yard or at any of her windows. I thought maybe my dad had been right, and was starting to feel glad that I hadn't done something drastic. That is, until one morning, when I found a woman's sock on my side of the fence, just sitting in my yard. I stared at it, feeling a chill run through me. This wasn't just her strange behavior anymore. She'd been on my property. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to confront her, but I was starting to feel like I couldn't ignore it either. I should have called the police right there, but I didn't because I didn't want to create issues with a neighbor. That night, as I was laying in bed, the doorbell started ringing. Not once, not twice, at least a dozen times, one right after the other. I didn't even need to look. I knew it was her. In my tired haze, I wasn't thinking clearly. I was more annoyed than scared. I got up, threw on a shirt, and went to the door, telling myself I'd just ask her to leave me alone. I told myself that I'd been putting this off for long enough, and it was about time I dealt with it. I have no idea why I wasn't scared in that moment. I still look back and cringe at how flippantly I handled the situation. I don't even want to say I was naive, but I can't think of a better word to describe my attitude to it all. The second I opened the door, she lunged at me. She ran full speed at me with a kitchen knife in her hand, her face twisted in rage. She started screaming, yelling something about how I had taken her son from her. I barely had time to process what was happening. I grabbed her arm, managing to wrestle the knife out of her grip, and I pinned her down on the floor. She was easy to overpower, but that didn't make the situation any less terrifying. My heart was racing and my hands were shaking as I held her there and called the police. She was still screaming nonsense about her son and told me that she was going to kill me. At one point she tried to bite me, but I wasn't going to let her go until the police arrived. It was the longest 5 minutes of my life. She never stopped screaming or squirming the entire time. When the police finally arrived, they restrained her and forced her into one of their cruisers. She screamed the whole time, and I could still hear her screaming even after they shoved her in the car. I had never been more scared in my life. The police made sure I was okay and told me she'd be sent to some kind of psychiatric facility. I never saw her again after that. This incident still weighs pretty heavily on my mind and has definitely made me a more paranoid and cautious person. I ended up moving out not even a year later.
Good stories. Highway. 5.
When I was in college, I used to house sit for a family for a few years when they would go on their annual family vacations. I've had a handful of other scary, creepy experiences, but the one I want to talk about today was the one that forced me to quit house sitting for them. I was in my 20s and was trying to make ends meet. House sitting was one of the many side hustles I had. The family would be going on a 2-week vacation abroad and wouldn't have any service, so if anything went wrong, I would have to call the police or their relatives depending on the situation. Please keep in mind that I've already had a few creepy experiences with their house prior to this, but it was never scary enough to deter me because they paid me very well. I used to work at an animal shelter, so I was well versed in animal care, and I knew about cat behavior. This family had 4 cats who were all very well behaved. For the first few days, all was well. I slept in the guest bedroom and went to school from their house because they lived close enough to where I could just walk to class and didn't have to pay for parking or bring lunch since I could just go back to their place. Then the issues began after a few days. My boyfriend at the time came over with dinner to keep me company, as he knew I was always a bit creeped out by the house. We sat in the guest bedroom and watched TV for a few hours eating, until he said he needed to go home. Sometimes he'd sleep over, but he told me on this particular night that he had a strong gut feeling he needed to sleep at home. He urged me to go home because that gut feeling he had was really bad. At that point, it was around midnight, and to be honest, I didn't want to go home. To put it bluntly, I have a complicated home life and didn't get along with my parents. The only time I'd get a break from home was the annual house sitting once a year, and I didn't feel like wasting it. My only sibling, who's also my best friend, moved out due to the toxicity, and honestly, home wasn't home without them anymore. I told him that I'll be fine and I'll lock up after he left. He was still really uneasy and tried to persuade me to go home once again. He tried to explain that while he had slept over before, for some reason tonight the house just felt unsettling. I thought it was because the house was over a century old, but it was just renovated, so I felt better about it.
Oh.
I reminded him that there was a home security alarm that I always set,
One
the neighborhood
simply.
was safe, and I had 4 friendly cats with me. He reluctantly left and drove home, and that was when it started happening. I shut all the doors and windows, locked everything, and set the security alarm. Once I got comfortable in bed, the TV started to turn on by itself. We were just using the TV, so I thought I accidentally sat on the remote, but I saw the remote on the nightstand. I quickly turned it off. Just as it went off, it turned back on. I thought it was strange since the TV was working perfectly the entire night, but it was even stranger that when the TV turned on by itself, it went to this off channel like it was just black and white, like it had no signal. So I kept turning it off, and it kept turning on. I began to freak out and unplug the TV entirely. Even though I'd had creepy experiences before in this house, this one had never happened before. I told myself that the house was just renovated, maybe there were some wiring issues. I still didn't go home,
Yeah,
went
right.
and slept on the couch instead. The next day, my
Wiring
boyfriend came
issues.
over again. I told him about what happened the night before, and he told me that I should have just went home. I was pretty freaked out, but honestly, it was still not as bad as having to deal with my family. That night, we had dinner together again and watched a movie in the living room. For this next part, I do have to explain the house structure. The house is 2 floors. There's the first floor where you come in through the front door straight into the living room, and the second floor is actually the basement, which is essentially a big living room with another room that can be used as a spare bedroom. The stairs leading downstairs are incredibly creaky and creepy. I don't understand why they didn't fix it during the renovation. As for the cats, they love to be everywhere and anywhere. They all had the personality where they wanted to be around you, but not necessarily held or cuddled. They were all pretty calm cats that liked quieter environments. Of the 4 cats, there was one cat that was the youngest at around 3 years old, and he was just a bit smaller than the other 3. That night, as we watched the movies, my blood ran cold as I heard sounds from the basement that sounded like an infant crying. My boyfriend froze as he slowly turned to look at me, as if signaling to me silently if I heard it too. I remembered from my time working in the animal shelter during my training that sometimes cats sound like babies,
Cat.
especially if they're in duress. As I mentioned earlier, the cats like to be around people and will follow you around the house, but not close enough to cuddle. I counted and only counted 3. The little younger cat was missing. I figured it must be the younger cat and went downstairs to the basement where I found it stuck in the spare room. He was smaller but more energetic than the other cats. He somehow closed the door behind him and was stuck in the room all alone. I carried him up the stairs and we resumed the movie. Mid-movie, we did pause it as it was time to feed the cats. The owners had a strict food schedule for their cats. The cats' food station was in the kitchen, and the kitchen was the only area that connected to the basement. To best explain the layout of the house, the main entrance connects to the living room. The living room then diverges into 2 different sections. One connects to the kitchen and the other connects to 3 bedrooms. One being the spare bedroom, a master bedroom, and another bedroom that belongs to the family's child, with the living room being connected to the kitchen as well. The kitchen was the connecting area where you must enter it to go to the basement or living room. For these cats, the only time that they didn't want to be around humans was while they were eating and after they ate, as they like to take naps or rest with their full bellies. They like to nap in the master bedroom or the teenager's room, as it smells like their family. They always did this every year that I babysat them, so it wasn't new. It also wasn't unusual to not see them for a little bit after mealtime. We finished our movie and went into the kitchen, void of any cats. As we were enjoying dinner, we both once again heard crying noises from the basement. It was naturally louder because we were in the kitchen, which was closer to the basement. I didn't see any cats in the kitchen, and I didn't think to check the living room because I was panicking internally. My boyfriend was visibly creeped out, and I told him I'd check it out since it was likely the cat again. I couldn't help but notice that the cries sounded a little different from earlier. It was more frequent and higher pitched. I turned on the lights to the basement and slowly crept down the stairs, saying the cat's name. With each step, the crying got louder, but when I finally made it down, the crying abruptly stopped. I checked the spare room, any crevices, and under the couch. He was nowhere. At that point, I was feeling so scared I could hear my heartbeat in my head. I don't even go on regular walks, I definitely don't jog, and I absolutely don't run, but I ran up those stairs like my life depended on it. When I got back into the kitchen, I felt my whole body go cold as my heart sank. My boyfriend was standing in the kitchen with a horrid look on his face, as all 4 cats surrounded him. He told me that as I went down the stairs to the crying noises, the 4 cats came out at the same time from the area where the bedrooms were. No cat had been downstairs the entire time. I immediately and silently packed up my items, jammed it into my backpack, and we both left the house. For the remaining week, I would only return to the house once a day to clean the litter box and feed them. I know I was going against their eating schedule, but at that point, I really didn't care. After the last day, I locked up, dropped the keys into their hiding spot, thanked them for the opportunity, but that it was my last time, and I never returned. I hated that house, and looking back, the experiences I had each year seemed like it was escalating. I should have stopped much sooner. I still remember calling my sibling during the drive to my parents' house after the incident. I felt even worse when they revealed that they also had their own experience in that house and kept it away from me because they knew I was trying to save money to move out. They didn't want to scare me.
Dumb decision. That was a stupid decision.
First, I'll start off with descriptions of all of those involved. My name is Kelsey. I was 17 years old at the time of this event. I'm 5'3". My friend Haley's 5'8". My friend Sammy is 5'7". It was March 19th, 2016. I was dog sitting at my mom's friend's house for some extra cash to help me out before going off to college next year. It was a cool spring night, and the people I was dog sitting for have a super cool sunroom where my friends and I like to smoke, so I decided to invite 2 of my other friends over to spend the night and make this whole dog sitting thing more fun. Haley and Sammy were a little older, with Haley being 23 and Sammy being 22. They brought over some vodka for us to drink. We hung out for a couple hours, drinking, smoking, laughing, and catching up. Then we start to get a bunch of phone calls. Now normally this would not be weird, except for the fact that the phone was supposed to be disconnected. We ignore the first couple phone calls, thinking they'll leave a message or a call back in the morning, as it was nearly midnight. The calls were persistent, and we could tell this person was not going to leave us alone until we answered. Sammy decided to answer the phone, and there was a man on the line, claiming to have the owner's wallet at a gas station 25 minutes from the house, which did not make sense. This man insisted that we come pick up the wallet now, which we all found extremely odd. After minutes of this man insisting that it was urgent that we come pick up the wallet, Sammy finally got the man to understand that we were not leaving the house and that we'll get it in the morning. We hung up the phone and all got a weird feeling in our stomachs. We grabbed the dog Willis and run into the back bedroom, shut all the blinds, and locked the door. We already have impaired judgment because of the weed and booze. We talk things out and we decide we were just being paranoid, and the man was just trying to make sure we get the wallet back to the owner safely. Hours go by of us drinking and smoking some more. Then we decide to watch a funny movie and make some food to calm down and get ready for bed that night. We move from the sunroom to the living room and pop in a DVD. The sunroom is located in between the kitchen and living room of the house and the backyard by the pool. The door in between the pool and the sunroom does not have a lock on it, but the door that's in between the kitchen living room and the sunroom does not have a dog door for Willis to go out back to go to the bathroom. So we all agree that, although we were a little spooked by the phone call, we were in a safe neighborhood, and Willis would bark if anything were to come to the door. Time creeps by. We were laughing on the couches, Haley and I sitting next to each other on one, and Sammy across the room on the other. The clock struck 3 a.m., and that's when things started to get creepy. Remember earlier how we left the lockable door open to the sunroom so that Willis could get outside to pee? That's where he entered from. I'm fully immersed in the comedy, but do you ever get that unexplainable feeling that you're being watched by somebody? That feeling suddenly became overpowering. I turn towards the kitchen and see a dark mass hunched over in the kitchen. I freeze and for a second think I'm seeing things. I watch as this mass reaches up into the cabinet, and that's when I realize there's someone in the house. I nudge Haley's side with my elbow and say real quietly, "Haley, I think there's somebody in the house." She looks into the kitchen and screams bloody murder. This dark mass then whips his head around and looks directly at me. We make eye contact, and I felt my entire body tense up. All I could see were his piercing blue eyes contrasting against the orange lamp just below the cabinet on the table. Everything else was covered by his black hoodie, pants, shoes, and gloves. He even wore a ski mask that covered up to his nose and mouth. Sammy then gets up to look at what Haley and I are staring at, and somehow musters up the courage to yell, "Get the fuck out." He calmly closes the cabinet and slowly walks out the sunroom doors. We immediately get up and rush to the corner of the room farthest from where he was crouching and call 911. They arrive 3 minutes later and search the entire apartment, take our statements, and sit outside the house for the rest of the night to see if the intruder would come back. The three of us did not stick around long enough to see if he would. We leave our booze, weed, and my car all at the house with the cops and the dog and head home. We come back the next day to find clothes all throughout the house messed with, and crumbs by the doggy door, understandably so Willis wouldn't bark at whoever came in. To this day, we still have no idea who called us and or who came into that house. I have not been back since. I'm 28 years old. I've been an animal lover ever since I was a child, which led to me pursuing a career path that had to do with animals. I'm a veterinary assistant, but for a while I also had a little side gig in which I'd offer to house sit animals for people going away on vacation and such. This ranged from cats to dogs to birds. I had actually house sat entire weekends a few times for people who presumably didn't have any family available to watch them. Being a young female who also already works at a veterinary hospital, most people weren't intimidated by the idea of me staying in their house while they're gone. I wasn't just some random person off the street. My credentials were all over the internet. I got a response to my ad one day from a man named Jeremy seeking my services. He had a 20-something-year-old macaw and a cat that he needed to have watched for a weekend while he went away. He brought up a price right away and offered me $300 for the entire weekend. I accepted that offer because that was a fair deal. I have experience dealing with birds of all types, including macaws, but this would be my first time I'd ever watched one for an entire weekend. I met Jeremy at his house. It was a basic, normal corner house for the neighborhood. He was a short man in his late 50s if I had to guess. He had graying hair and a graying mustache. He seemed very friendly. In my experience, most animal lovers are. After meeting Jeremy, I met his bird Ringo and his cat Casper. Ringo was huge. I've handled macaws in the past, which I assumed was part of the reason Jeremy hired me. He told me about Ringo's personality and quirks and how to get him to quiet down if he makes noises. Ringo kept saying "Daddy's home" as Jeremy would handle him. He laughed and said that's what he says when he sees him. Ringo said a few other phrases along with that, all of them 2- or 3-word phrases. After showing me how to clean the cage and everything like that, he showed me the rest of the house and told me how often to feed Casper. He asked that I don't go into any other bedrooms upstairs besides the guest bedroom where I'd be sleeping, which was understandable. There was a bathroom upstairs right next to the bedroom, and he told me I could help myself to his food. However, I'm a vegan, so I brought my own food for the weekend. After all of this, and him getting to know me a bit, He gave me the key to the house and left. I watched through the window as he drove off, and I was left alone with Ringo and Casper. It was already late in the day at this point, like 8 p.m. It was dark out,
No.
so there wasn't much left to do that night. Casper was already fed, and Jeremy already left enough food in Ringo's cage for the night. The cage was in the living room in the center of the house, right next to the TV, so I turned on the TV and plopped down on the couch. Casper was hiding somewhere in the house out of sight. Ringo was just sitting in the cage watching me. After a couple of hours of watching TV and eating my little dinner, I went to bed. No reason to stay up super late. I slept with the bedroom door open, and I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound. The best way I could describe it was 2 loud cracking sounds. I sat up and listened for a second. Nothing. So I laid back down and went back to sleep. There was a giant bird in a cage downstairs. Hearing sounds was not unexpected. The next day was pretty easy. I cleaned up Casper's litter box, fed him, and fed Ringo. I let Ringo out to play for a couple of hours. He perched on the back of the couch behind me as I watched TV. Jeremy told me that Casper and Ringo typically ignore each other, so I wouldn't have to worry about one attacking the other. Fast forward a few hours, and I left the house to go explore the area a little bit. I went for a walk in the park and FaceTimed a couple of my friends. I did a little driving around too, and picked up some food for dinner that night before returning to the house. It was around 7 o'clock when I returned. I interacted with the pets for a couple of hours as I ate my dinner and watched TV. Jeremy was supposed to be returning home late tomorrow. I called it a night early again. I went to sleep with the door open again. However, once again, I woke up to a sound. This time, I believe it was the sound of the bedroom door closing. I looked up and saw that the bedroom door was now closed. While the windows were open, there was little to no wind to create a draft. This was weird. I also could hear sounds from downstairs. It sounded like Ringo moving about in his cage, talking. I got out of my bed to check on him and make sure he's okay. As I was walking down the stairs, I heard him talking more clearly. I got to the cage and saw he was wide awake and walking around. I remember what Jeremy told me to do to get him to quiet down, hand him a particular treat. I dug into the bag to grab one, but then he said the phrase, "Daddy's home." I found that odd and slightly unsettling. I put a treat in front of Ringo's face and he grabbed it. This ultimately did end up getting him to stop making noise, but it still felt weird that he'd wake up in the middle of the night. I went back to the bedroom and left the door open. I fell back asleep, and I shit you not, I woke up once again, maybe a little more than an hour later. This time I didn't hear what woke me up, but I looked up in the room in a daze, and in the near pitch black darkness of the room, I saw a black mass in the center of the room, moving away from the bed and out the door. I sat up and almost screamed until I fully came to. I now had to wonder if what I just saw was a hallucination or not. I grabbed my phone to turn on the flashlight, but on the screen, I saw I had gotten a text from Jeremy around an hour ago. It was him telling me that if Ringo makes noises in the middle of the night, it's normal and to ignore it. I stared at my screen, rereading the text at least 10 times. That text was sent conveniently around the same time I got up to give Ringo a treat. I felt ill all of a sudden. That black mass in the room I just saw. What if that were real? What if it wasn't a hallucination? I got out of bed and turned on the lamp. I started packing my bag as quickly as possible. I didn't bring many clothes, so I was packed very quickly. I quietly went to the bathroom next to grab all my toiletries quick. And then I tiptoed back out of the bathroom, and I was in the near pitch black upstairs hallway with all the bedroom doors. I looked down the hallway, and I could swear I heard the faintest sound coming from one of the bedrooms. I don't know why, but this overwhelming curiosity almost hypnotized me, and I crept down the hall to what I presumed to have been the master bedroom. I put my ear up close to the door, and I heard a rattling sound. It sounded like a bed rocking. He was in there. That fucking creep. I knocked on the door and said, "Jeremy, are you in there?" The rocking sound stopped, and there was now dead silence. I repeated myself, and this time said, "If you're in the house, I need to know right now before I leave." Still silence. I left the house in a hurry, leaving the key on the table, and I didn't look back. On my drive home, I sent him a long voice text saying I'm considering reporting this to the authorities as some sort of stalker or breach of privacy situation, and that I was extremely disturbed that he was in the house. He immediately tried calling me 3 times, but I was honestly too scared to pick up. He then sent me a text apologizing and stating that his brother unexpectedly came home that night. I knew it was complete horseshit. I demanded he just pay me and I won't pursue this any further. He sent me a payment via Zelle, and that was that. I hate to even mention this part, but the next day, I realized I was missing a certain article of clothing from my bag that I know for a fact was grabbed out of my bag by him. I have largely chosen to block this memory out. This will be the first and last time I ever write a detailed recounting of this experience.
Wait.
Saying I'm considering reporting this to the authorities as
Oh,
some
3. Wait. Cornfield. Basement. People are so weird. Treehouse. Highway. Pit stop. How many videos? Oh, 409 videos. Oh, truck. Another day. Urban exploration. No, let's go treehouse. Bye.
Before getting into today's stories, I'd like to take a moment to thank this video's sponsor, Pi.org. If you're anything like me, then that means you can't stand browsing the web with annoying pop-ups and ads constantly clogging up your screen. We've all heard of ad blockers, but the one that I've been using lately is Pi.org, which is a superior ad blocker that sweeps away all those annoying pop-ups and ads, including those annoying cookie pop-ups from websites wanting to collect your information. This is how websites are able to show you ads centered around what you've been Googling. A cool feature is visual mode, which allows you to watch all of the ads on the page you're on actually disappearing to let you visualize how much space you're saving. In my opinion though, the coolest part of Pi.org is the Rewards for Ads program, in which when you enable it, you can earn cash back for seeing Pi-approved ads. And you'll also receive cash back when making a transaction through a cashback offer while online shopping. So for a genuinely better ad-free experience, just go to pi.org/Mr. Nightmare, click Add to Chrome, and just follow the on-screen steps to complete the setup. And also add the Pi Shopping Companion extension for coupons, cashback, and rewards. When I was a kid, around 9 or 10, my dad got a really high-paying job that forced us to move from middle-of-nowhere Pennsylvania to Brookmont, Maryland. I say forced, but that's probably not the best way to describe what happened. In reality, my parents were thrilled to make the move. It was a decision they barely thought about. In the span of about a month, we went from this tiny, rundown house in a relatively low-income area to a massive property in one of Maryland's nicest suburbs. You might be wondering how I felt about the whole thing. At that age, I was a pretty antisocial kid and mostly kept to myself, so it's not like I was leaving any lifelong friends behind. I didn't really have any to begin with. Years later, my parents would tell me that the prospect of giving me a fresh start was one of the reasons they were so willing to uproot our entire lives, but that's neither here nor there. The move didn't bother me much, and I was able to adjust pretty quickly. It's not like adjusting was very difficult given the circumstances though. Like I said, the house was huge, and even my 10-year-old self could pick up on the fact that we wouldn't be struggling to make ends meet anymore. I'm not going to bore you about the pointless details about the inside of the house. I'll only tell you what you need to know. I had 2 older brothers, Sean and Harold. The backyard was easily our favorite part. It had a big plot of twisting hedges that made for perfect games of hide and seek, tag, or whatever else we came up with. But the best feature by far was the treehouse at the right edge of the property. Each house on the block was separated by a decently large cluster of tall trees, and the treehouse was situated directly within that patch. I say treehouse, but it was more like a tree castle. It wasn't your dad's run-of-the-mill weekend project. It was massive, spanning 6 or 7 adjacent trees. It had 3 different levels and an actual staircase built into it, not those flimsy planks you're probably used to seeing. It was obvious a professional had built it. For a while, my brothers and I played in the treehouse every day. It was always the highlight of our day. But eventually, my brothers got bored of the treehouse. They were older and in that awful teenage phase where nothing was cool anymore. Eventually, I was the only one who played up there, which kind of sucked. I was really torn up about basically being abandoned up there, but my brothers refused to come back no matter what I said. One day, I climbed up into the treehouse and found a folded piece of paper sitting in the corner. To this day, I still remember the exact words written on that first note. It said, "Hello, I'm the Marshmallow Man. It's nice to meet you. What's your name?" I was the happiest kid alive. I assumed it was one of my brothers playing a game with me, so I played along, hoping to reinterest them in the treehouse. There was a stack of paper in the treehouse that hadn't been there before, so I eagerly picked up one of the markers we had in there and wrote back, leaving a little note with my name. I placed it where I had found the first one, excited to play this new game. That night, I wanted to ask my brothers which of them was the Marshmallow Man, but I was afraid they'd stop playing if I said anything, so I kept quiet. For the next few days, I'd come home from school and run straight to the treehouse. Each time, there'd be another note waiting for me. At first, the notes were innocent and sounded exactly like stuff my brothers would say. I was having a lot of fun with it, but as the days went on, the notes got stranger. The Marshmallow Man started asking me increasingly personal questions that I didn't fully understand. Things that didn't make sense for my brothers to ask, like, what's your favorite time of day to play outside? Or what do you usually eat for breakfast? I don't remember every question he asked, but one of them that will always stick with me was, which window in the house is your bedroom?
Huh.
I look back at that exact question and literally feel sick to my stomach. At the time, I still didn't think too much of it. I assumed it was still one of my brothers, so I answered every question without hesitation. But the next note was so unsettling that I couldn't keep quiet anymore. It was something like, "What do your pajamas smell like?" or something nasty along those lines. I stormed inside and confronted my brothers, demanding to know which of them was behind the notes. They both started laughing at me and denied it. Both of them swore there was no such thing as the Marshmallow Man and started making fun of me for still playing make-believe. I started crying and ran out of the room. I remember being a mixture of sad and angry. I knew one of them had to be lying. Instead of going to my parents, I hatched a plan to catch them in the act. I was not prepared for what was about to happen. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard tapping at my window. I froze, feeling my heart start to beat out of my chest. I was already scared of the dark to begin with, so the tapping added a layer of fear that I couldn't deal with. I sat there in the dark for what felt like hours, too scared to move. Eventually, I forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I pulled back the window curtains and almost screamed. Taped to the outside of my window were dozens of marshmallows. It had to be my brothers. I was so angry. This wasn't funny anymore. I decided I'd catch them red-handed the next night. I pretended like I hadn't noticed the marshmallows and didn't say a thing to either of them all day. Later that night, I was ready. When the tapping started again, I jumped out of bed and yanked the curtains open, ready to yell at them. But it wasn't my brothers. On the other side of the glass was a man, an old, disgusting man with yellow eyes and what looked like rotting teeth. He had patchy hair on his head and smiled at me when he noticed me looking. I don't think I've ever screamed louder in my life. I felt like I was gonna die in that moment. My parents came running, but by the time they got to my room, the man was gone. It was a huge thing. The police searched the property, combing through every inch of the yard and treehouse, but they didn't find anything. They even checked the surrounding area, but that man was never found. Some of our neighbors came outside to see what was going on and reacted in horror when my parents filled them in. I told the police and my parents everything I knew, but there wasn't much I could even say. They took the notes in as evidence, but I doubt they really did anything with them. That man never came back. My parents told me to never play in the treehouse again, but it's not like I wanted to after that incident anyway. I moved out of that house a while ago, but my parents still live there, and I always take an extra long look at the treehouse whenever I'm back. This remains one of the scariest things that has ever happened to me.
Crazy people. Damn, too much revolution.
This memory has been on my mind a lot lately. My youngest son Luke just went off to college, and while I'm proud of him, the house feels quieter than it ever has before. Too quiet, if I'm being honest. It's funny, when the kids are young, you dream of peace and quiet, but when it finally comes, it's not as comforting as you thought it would be. I don't know why, but his going away unlocked a part of my brain that honestly forgot about what I'm about to tell you. People have told my wife and I that it's normal to be thinking a little extra about memories from my kid's childhood at a time like this, so I guess it's not too surprising. I still remember when he was just a little kid, full of energy and curiosity, always getting into something. There's one memory I have of that time that is definitely not all sunshine and rainbows, though. Luke was 8 years old when this happened. Even now, I can't fully make sense of it. I'm a carpenter by trade, so I'm pretty good with my hands. Always have been. I will admit that I was much more lively back then, willing to undertake all sorts of makeshift projects and such. One of my favorite projects was the treehouse I built for Luke in the backyard, which is still standing to this day. It wasn't just a simple platform nailed to a tree. I poured my heart into it. Walls, a roof, proper wooden steps leading up to the entrance. It was sturdy, too. I wanted it to feel like an extension of our house to him, and I definitely succeeded in that regard. My wife Christy wasn't thrilled about it at first. She worried it was too high off the ground and unsafe. But Luke was the kind of kid who was always climbing trees anyway, and I figured it would be safer to give him a proper ladder rather than let him scramble up branches that could snap. Christy eventually came around, and Luke absolutely loved it. I should probably tell you a little bit about our property so that the story makes more sense. Our house was at the very end of a dead-end street in a relatively woodsy area. The backyard actually bordered the woods, which was part of why Christy and I fell in love with the house in the first place. It was private and peaceful, and we're kind of people that like keeping to ourselves. I still laugh when I think about all the times friends and family members have gotten lost trying to find our house. The yard wasn't huge, but I could clearly see the treehouse from our bedroom window, which was one of the deciding factors when I was determining where to build it. I wanted to be able to keep an eye on it should Luke hurt himself or something like that. I couldn't actually see inside of it because of the walls, but I had a perfect view of the steps leading up to it. From what I remember, everything was relatively normal for a pretty long time. Luke spent what I considered a normal amount of time playing in the treehouse. His older brother had kind of outgrown that phase, so Luke mostly played by himself in there. I can't remember exactly when, but at one point he started talking about an imaginary friend named Jake. We knew he was an imaginary friend because no one in the neighborhood had a child named Jake. It wasn't unusual for kids to have imaginary friends, but Luke was 8, not exactly the age where you'd still expect that sort of thing. Christy thought it was cute and innocent, but I was a little more skeptical. It seemed odd to me since Luke hadn't been the type of kid to make imaginary friends. Regardless, I didn't think much of it because he was only 8 years old. It started to get a little more concerning when Christy and I realized that Luke was starting to spend more and more time up there. What struck me as strange was that he wasn't bringing toys up there. As far as I could tell, he only had his imagination to play with. It's not like he had a game console or anything to keep him entertained, and I had been very clear about not carrying anything up there alone, as it was dangerous and I didn't want him to fall. At one point, my curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to ask him about it. Luke acted extremely weird when I asked him about his friend, and said that Jake was shy and didn't like being talked about. When I asked him why he was spending so much time up there, he told me that Jake only liked to play in the treehouse and that he didn't like coming inside. I honestly didn't know what to say. It seemed like a pretty bizarre condition. Weren't imaginary friends supposed to be available wherever and whenever you needed them? I did some research later that day and found out that some kids only play with their imaginary friends in certain rooms of their house. So as weird as it was, I accepted it. Christy was pretty uneasy though. She thought Luke was taking this imaginary friend thing too far, and I honestly agreed. We weren't helicopter parents though. When it came to our kids, we let them spend their free time however they wanted to, as long as they were doing well in school and completing their chores. Most weekends, we'd let Luke play with the neighborhood kids until the sun went down. They'd ride bikes, play tag, and usual stuff. They were all good kids, and we trusted Luke to behave himself and stay out of trouble. He wasn't the type of kid to pick on other kids or get into fights, which was why I was especially concerned when Luke came home one Saturday with a black eye. I cleaned him up and asked him what happened. He looked down at the floor and didn't say anything, but I insisted that he tell me what happened and I wouldn't be mad at him. What he said next made me shiver. He looked up at me and told me that he had gotten into a fight with Jake. I had to process whose kid Jake was before realizing that he was talking about his imaginary friend. I told him not to lie to me and that he wasn't being funny. Instead of fessing up, Luke just started crying and ran to his room. Christy was convinced he'd gotten into a fight with one of the neighborhood kids and didn't want to admit it. I agreed with that. She wanted me to take down the treehouse right then and there, and I couldn't bring myself to do it. That treehouse had taken weeks of hard work, and the thought of tearing it down didn't sit right with me. I told her that I'd talk with Luke and tell him that he was taking things way too far. Luke refused to come out of his room or talk to me for the rest of the day, so getting something out of him wasn't going to happen. The next day, I decided to investigate. When I climbed up into the treehouse, what I saw made my stomach churn. Scattered around were children's socks and sneakers, all dirty and tattered. I knew for a fact that none of them belonged to Luke. I also knew for a fact that they weren't my older son's either. We had donated all of his old shoes a long time ago. That's not all that was up there. There were also food wrappers, bags, utensils, even a couple of dirty plates. Weirdest of all, there were pencil drawings of wild animals on all the walls. There was a fox, a bear, some deer. I don't remember all of them, but I do remember that they were all animals. The one that stood out to me the most was what appeared to be a gigantic spider with a face that was just completely penciled over. It was just downright freaky. I immediately climbed down and asked Luke about the treehouse. He told me that Jake only liked to talk on a full stomach, so he had to bring him food and other snacks. He then told me that the shoes and socks were also Jake's, and that Jake was pretty forgetful in general. That was it. From that moment on, I forbade Luke from going into the treehouse. I knew he was still lying to me, and I wanted to punish him until he admitted to it. I was 100% sure that Luke had found those things around the neighborhood and was making up stories to cover it up. Christy was worried about Luke's mental health, and I was too. We thought about consulting a professional should things continue. But one evening, I saw something that changed everything. I was looking out the bedroom window when I spotted movement near the treehouse. At first, I was livid that Luke was disobeying me, but then I realized what I was looking at. A sickly, frail-looking child was climbing down the treehouse steps. It wasn't Luke. He didn't look like any of the kids from the neighborhood either. His clothes were dirty, and he moved like he hadn't eaten in days. I ran outside, yelling for that kid to stop. As soon as I opened the back door, the boy darted into the woods. I chased after him, but he was freakishly fast. Within seconds, he disappeared into the trees. Christy called every parent in the neighborhood, but all their kids were accounted for. We called the police, who searched the woods thoroughly for over an hour, but found nothing. No missing children had been reported in the area either. The whole thing was beyond explanation. With my consent, the police questioned my son about that kid, and what he told them was horrifying. Apparently, Jake claimed to be a magic boy who lived in the woods with his other friends. His friends were supposedly all animals, as he called them bear, fox, and names like that. Every time Jake would come to visit my son, He'd beg him to leave his family behind and join him in the woods with the rest of his friends.
Oh,
He'd then get mad when Luke would refuse and make these strange noises. I don't know why Luke never told me any of it, and there was a part of me that felt responsible for putting him in danger like that. The police conducted a full search of the woods but never found a thing. We never saw Jake again after that. Christy has always been incredibly superstitious and theorized that Jake wasn't real. I don't believe in stuff like that, but the way she talks about it always gives me an unsettling feeling. I honestly don't know which explanation is freakier, the fact that some paranormal entity was interacting with my son, or the thought that there might be woods folk lurking around somewhere in the forest behind my house. This happened a few weeks ago, so it's still fresh in my mind. I live in a quiet suburb in Delaware, but I'm a sophomore in college out in California. This happened during fall break in October, when I was back home for a few days. I come home every chance I can, which honestly always feels a little bittersweet. I love seeing my parents, but they're really traditional, which can be suffocating. One of the things that drives me crazy is how uptight they are about weed. Even though it's recently been legalized here, they'd lose their minds if they knew I smoked. They've never really gotten used to the idea that I'm an adult now. I can't really understand their position on the whole thing, but at the end of the day, they are my parents, and I would never disrespect them, especially while I'm under their roof. Whenever I'm home, I have to sneak around to avoid getting caught. I hate to admit it, but sneaking around my parents is a skill I've mastered over the years. I can't even count the number of times I've snuck out of the house late at night, let alone all the other mischievous shit I used to do. My dad has the nose of a bloodhound, so smoking inside isn't an option.
dang.
Thankfully, my old tree house is still standing in the front yard. My parents built it for me when I was a kid, and even though it's weathered and creaky in some spots, it's held up surprisingly well. It's high enough in the trees that it's basically hidden from view, especially from the house. From up there, I can see everything. The yard, the street, some windows of the house, but no one can see me unless they know exactly where to look. When I was younger, that treehouse was the place I went when I needed to escape, which, if you knew what I was like as a child, was relatively often. It's honestly kind of hard to talk about with all the old memories flooding back, but I'll get to the point. On the Saturday before I was supposed to fly back to school, my parents were out at some banquet or something that was going to run late into the evening. I knew they wouldn't be home for hours, but I didn't know exactly when they'd be returning. I didn't want to risk getting caught in the backyard, so I climbed up into the treehouse with my stash just to be safe. It was chilly out, and I could see my own breath in the air. I have this theory that cold weather induces more nostalgia, but that might just be me.
Dang.
It was quiet and peaceful up there, and it was nice being the only one around. I've always liked being up high too, so that definitely added to the experience. I watched the sunset as I thought about school, excited to go back. By the time I finished, it was mostly dark outside, meaning I had timed things just right. That's when I noticed it. As I was panning my eyes across the yard, a light turned on in the house. I froze, knowing I was the only one home. My heart started racing as I stared at the window, feeling that instinctual sense of fear that only arises from true danger. My field of vision began closing in around that single source of light, as if it were drawing me in. A few moments later, movement in the backyard snapped me out of my disassociative state. 3 hooded figures were circling the property, clearly trying to move quickly. My stomach dropped as I realized what was happening. I watched as the 3 figures moved to the front steps. That's when a 4th figure opened the door and let them in. My chest tightened as it hit me. My house was being robbed. I didn't know what to do, but I couldn't look away. Part of me was still frozen, and another part of me was still trying to convince myself that what I was seeing was real. That's the best way I can explain what I was feeling in that moment. One of the figures stayed outside, pacing the yard. I think some subconscious part of me clicked, because I looked down and my phone was in my hand, open to the keypad on my phone app. Without thinking, I dialed 911 and whispered into the phone, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I told the operator what was happening and hung up. But as I was putting my phone away, the light from the screen must have caught the guy's eye, because he whipped his head to look up into the trees. I ducked, but I was worried he had seen me. Not 3 seconds later, I got my answer. I heard a voice yell out, "Hey," clearly directed at me. I peeked around one of the wooden floor pieces and saw a dark figure walking towards the base of the tree. He knew where I was sure of it. He got to the base of the tree and started climbing the wooden planks that led up to the treehouse. I screamed that police were on their way, hoping to scare him off, but he didn't stop. He just kept climbing, his hands gripping the planks like he was determined to get to me. Without thinking, I grabbed my bong, the only thing within reach, and threw it as hard as I could. It hit him in the head and shattered into a million pieces, and he let out a loud curse before falling to the ground. He wasn't very high up, but it was enough to make him reconsider. Instead of climbing back up again, he ran back towards the house and shouted at the other guys who were still inside. The next thing I saw was all 4 of them running to my backyard, where they presumably entered and exited from. My heart was still beating like crazy. Not even 3 minutes later, the police arrived. I was shaking so badly as I climbed down from the treehouse that I thought I was going to fall. I tried to tell them what had happened, but my words were a mess. I told them that I hadn't seen a getaway car and that I didn't get a good look at any of their faces. My parents pulled in not long after that. They were really sympathetic about the whole thing, which I was grateful for. The police told us that the robbers must have known my parents would be out that night. It seemed like a planned job, but what they didn't plan for was me being there. I still don't know how to feel about it. I especially don't want to think about what would have happened had that guy gotten all the way up to the treehouse. I'm back at school now, but if I'm being honest, I haven't had a good night's sleep since this incident. I'm terrified those people might come back, and even more terrified that my parents are there all alone. I'm worried sick about their safety, and I just hope that's the last we ever hear of them. I hope I never have to give an update, but I will if God forbid something comes up.
Oh, there is another story, okay. Hello?
When I was a kid, I had a very nightmarish experience at my childhood home. My family moved to this house when I was like 4, so I really don't remember anything of the house we lived in when I was born. We lived in what I call my childhood house from when I was 4 to when I was 14, so exactly 10 years. I loved that house. I have very good memories from growing up there. We moved out of state when I was just beginning high school, which was a nightmare in of itself, but that's nothing to do with this story. In the backyard of my childhood home was a treehouse. It was built by the previous owner for his kids. Believe it or not, when my parents viewed the house, a major selling point was the kid-friendly nature of the house and the backyard for my older brother and I. My brother Kyle is 2 years older than me, so he was 6 when they bought the house. And my brother and I apparently were very excited over the treehouse aspect in the backyard, according to my parents. My brother and I would play in the treehouse with friends we'd made over the years. But as the years passed, I would stop playing in the treehouse like that at a certain age. By the age of 12, I was obviously not playing in the treehouse anymore, but I was admittedly a troublemaker around this age, and I would often get in trouble with my parents. I'd get grounded often, and in general I'd just throw a lot of temper tantrums and there would be a lot of yelling in the house. One weekend, my dad grounded me for a repeat complaint from my guidance counselor about my behavior and grades in school, and like an angsty, annoying preteen, I thought I hated my parents at that moment. That night, I refused to sleep in the house. I took a couple blankets and pillows and went outside to the treehouse to sleep up there. It wasn't the first time I'd done this, and my parents would know about it when I'd do it. They didn't care. It was my little way of rebelling. Little did my dad know that I had my Nintendo DS with me, even though I wasn't allowed to play video games or watch TV. I played Animal Crossing for literally hours before getting tired and eventually going to sleep, but I think I was only asleep for a few moments. I don't think I even entered REM sleep yet when I woke up to a voice from outside calling my name. Tommy. Tommy. I was still confused as I was waking back up. It could have been my dad's voice. Tommy, are you up there? The voice said. All I remember is it being a deep, grown man's voice. I didn't reply. My heart started to race for some reason. I heard the steps of the ladder squeaking as someone was coming up. And then, in the near pitch black darkness, I saw someone poke their head through the opening in the floor. I couldn't see their face. I just saw the shadow of the outline of their head. He said, "Ah, there you are." I replied, "Dad?" But this was where he stopped responding entirely. For about 20 seconds, I stared at this head that I presume was staring back at me. I was waiting for my eyes to readjust to the darkness, but something told me that that wasn't my dad. I stood up and went to the window of the treehouse and started screaming "Dad" as loud as I could. I saw the light in my parents' room turn on, and I also heard footsteps hurrying down the ladder to the treehouse. Moments later, my parents burst outside through the back door, and my dad swore to me that he wasn't out there playing a prank on me. My parents believed me. It wasn't like some stupid horror movie where the parents don't believe a word the kid says. My uncle was still an active cop at the time, and so my dad called him for advice, and my uncle made a report on the incident the next day. Not much information I could give besides I heard a deep man's voice and saw the outline of his head, and that he knew my name. Not much the police could work with. Obviously, I never spent a night in the treehouse again. My dad for a while thought it was one of the neighbors directly across from us, but he could never prove it. For years, whenever I'd see him outside and he'd say hi to me, I'd try to think back to the voice from that night, but I just couldn't remember it clearly enough to make a comparison. It still remains a very unsettling mystery in the back of my mind.
Oh no. Let's go with piggyback call. Garage manager. Descarga porta. 1, 2. Iveco Stralis Highway. Okay. White, green, orange. I don't have the green one. Ah. Wait, I don't want to drive this. Oh my god. Ah. No, 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 no. Ah, damn. This. Status. There. Okay. Now. No, not purchase. Ah, yeah. .5, 1.7. Okay, I have money for another truck. So man. Green and orange. Green. Orange. Put okay, let's buy more man trucks. Here. Here. Okay. interesting. Okay, one more. This one. Okay, that's enough. If I want to buy small, damn. Okay, the price is always the same. Okay. Almost. It's almost 2 a.m. Okay. It's time to finish this. Thanks for watching. Bye.